Well, hello everybody. It's great to be here with this fine panel of fellow authors here. Um, Today's topic is whether you're a plotter or a pantser when it comes to writing. Now, before we go any further, probably I ought to just clarify what we mean by plotter and pantser so that we're all using the same terminology. A plotter is somebody who plans their book well in advance in any amount of detail, from simply writing out chapter headings to going through the whole what's known as the snowflake method, where you actually plan out each scene, each conversation in increasing detail and end up with this enormous detailed skeleton of your book before you actually start the proper writing. Whereas a pantser is so called because they fly by the seat of their pants and make it up as they go along. Now, I had always thought of myself as a bit of a planner, in that my background's in journalism and in marketing and PR and writing brochures and all that sort of thing, where you have to plan what you're doing. You've got a limited amount of space to put things in, so you have to be quite meticulous about planning. But on the other hand, I think I'm a little bit of a pantser, and I don't know if you can be both, in that my ideas often start off with, my stories start off with a single moment observed or a little bit of conversation or something, and that's what gets me going rather than an actual plan. But I do plan quite meticulously when I'm writing a non-fiction book. Now, my background's in writing short stories and in writing non-fiction. I'm currently working on my first novel. One of the things that I did to try and get myself going on the first novel was to do NaNoWriMo, where the rules are basically, although you're allowed to plan in advance, once 1st of November hits, then you have to go into full-blown pantser mode. You're not allowed to go back and edit. You just keep writing and writing and writing. And your aim there is not so much to get your story written to a particular structure as to write your 50,000 words within a month. I found that a completely alien experience, and thought I need to speak to some other writers to find out how they cope, what's the best, how they work, what works for them, whether there are any tricks that I'm missing, whether you can actually change from being a plotter to a pantser, whether you should even try to change. I suspect there are no overall rules, but I knew that gathering together these three people here on the panel, who all have strong views, who are all established authors, written very well received books, have got their methods sorted, I thought it'd be great to have a chat amongst ourselves to share advice and practice. So shall we kick off just by introducing all three of you, and you can tell us a little bit about how you work, whether you consider yourself a plotter or a pantser, and why, and then we can perhaps get a conversation underway to see the differences and similarities between the ways that we work. So shall we start off with Rosalind Minette, whose novels and short stories I've enjoyed very much, and she also writes a very interesting blog about her writing. So Rosalind, would you like to say a few words about yourself?
Hello, I'm Rosalind Minette. I write predominantly satirical dramas, which I haven't yet published. What I have published is the first two books of a trilogy, finished the third book, and I've published satirical short stories, and I've started a series of ebooks which are crime shorts. And I'm talk fiction, say whether I'm a plotter or a pantser, because I think the two forms of writing are very separate. If I was talking about, I would be planning. I'd know the subject. I would know the topic I was writing about. I'd know how it would sort of segment. I would know the sequence of what I was going to write, and I'd know which areas were going to receive the most impact and detail. When it comes to writing fiction, I am such a pantser. I am totally, I think all my bones are dyed, not just my wool. I think I would kill any fiction writing in me if I went down the plotting. Um, it's a matter of starting with a very blank sheet and, like Debbie said, a germ of an idea, a very tiny one, and I start to write, not knowing what will happen. And I continue like that. I know what's going to happen in chapter 2 when I finish chapter 1, the first third of the book. I would say somewhere past halfway, I know exactly how it's going to end. But I don't write chapter notes. The only notes I've got are if I stop somewhere and I need to research. In historical fiction, obviously, you have to be accurate. So if I want an event being wounded, I will stop and go to the records office to get the information. I'll write notes in that sense. But as for notes planning my work ahead on the novel, no, never. And I think that's...
It sounds to me a little bit as if there's some subconscious or unconscious planning going on in the background there, in that you say halfway through you know how it's going to end by the time you get halfway through, would you say?
Yes.
Yes.
I know how it's going to end, and I might even stop at that point and write the ending, but not necessarily.
That's interesting. That's another thing that I've not managed to do, is to write pieces out of order, which is challenging. Some advice that I've read includes, if you get stuck at one point, then go on and write the next bit and come back to that, which is a different approach.
I think that's good advice.
Let's move on to Keith then, before we start addressing some of the interesting issues that you've raised there. Keith.
Hi. Well, at the moment I'm mostly writing crime fiction, though I've written recently a literary work and also a romance novel. But I think I've had like two phases to my career, such as it is, in that when I was 20, I took time off work and I spent 2 years doing nothing but writing, and I wrote 7 novels in 2 years. Well, I had nothing else to do. But that was my commitment. I was going to make a go of this writing business. And the way I operated then was to have, I'd kind of wait until I had a beginning, a middle, and an end. And those were my 3 elements. So I wrote away from the beginning towards the middle, and away from the middle towards the end, and I'd be making it up more or less as I went along. And that kind of worked for me in as much as the books got written, but I don't know that they were any good or particularly gripping as novels. And then life got in the way, and I had to do lots of different things to earn a living. And I came back to writing more seriously, I guess, about 10 years ago now, and started my my crime series. And in the last 2-3 years, I guess I've written 8 books, and that has been entirely because I've moved towards a plotting mode of working. My first 2 books in that series were entirely pantsed, and they were pants, I think, in that the first one took 7 years to write, and the second one took 4 years to write, because I was constantly having to go back and change things and rework the structure and change things around. And then I started thinking more seriously about what I was doing, and doing more reading around how to structure and how novels worked, how books worked, and what the reader experience was, and moreover what the reader expectation was when they were reading. I'd done a lot of work when I was lecturing on structures of novels and how, from Jung and his archetypes through Vladimir Prop and the structure of folk tales, it is possible to understand how stories work and how people expect stories to work. And I thought, well, one ought to be able to, if you like, do that more deliberately, rather than waiting for the archetypes to arrive in your writing, to think about what constitutes a hero, what constitutes a villain, what constitutes a good plot. And since that time, I've started thinking in more detail about that, and then just elaborating that into the kind of detailed plan that I'm now working with.
So your detailed plan includes making sure that you have what you consider the essential elements, and what are the sort of the tried and trusted
Yes.
essential elements that make a good book.
Exactly. And a good story.
Yes, yeah. We'll come back to this question in a minute, and we've had a proper introduction for David about the reader's perspective, because it's terribly easy for writers to talk to Kingdom Come about what works for them, but it will be interesting to think about, as you've raised there, whether it matters to the reader. Can the reader tell whether a book has been plotted or pantsed? So I must admit, I was very surprised to hear Rosalind's attitude, and I'd read her novels and thought they were extremely well plotted, and they all flowed and were coherent and balanced and everything. So it's quite surprising. So we'll come back to that in a minute after we've over to David for a quick intro to David, for anyone who doesn't already know David.
Indeed, everybody does.
Absolutely.
That's an interesting. I think the reader can tell if you've plotted or pantsed it, but it depends upon the skill of the writer, how much of that they can see. We've all read stuff that people have sent us that's just been made up and is total stream of consciousness gibberish. But anyway, I think my background and experience is actually not that dissimilar to Keith's, in that slightly different. In that I didn't stop work and take 2 years off to write. I simply went on the dole in the 70s and took 18 months to write. Although I wrote my first novel when I was working in Oxford for Pergamon Press, and I can remember sitting in a bay window in an upstairs bedsit, typing away at this book. And when I first started to write those books, I was entirely a pantser. I had never heard of plot. I didn't know how anything worked. I simply sat down and an idea came into my head, and I wrote about it. Through some fluke of some kind, I actually ended up with an agent and had that novel published, as well as 3 others throughout the 70s. Going back and reading them now is a painful exercise. Because you would almost... I like the fact that I was a published author, and mixing with other published authors, and my agent would come and take me out for lunch and all sorts of things. But they are dire now. I got my rights to them back a couple of years ago with the idea of republishing them, but having read them again, I'd either have to rewrite them completely or probably not bother at all. So I've got better things to do. So anyway, I stopped writing for 35 or more years, but never wanted not to write. So I came back to it about 5 or 6 years ago, and coming back to it, I started, probably like Keith and probably like all of us actually, I started to read an awful lot of craft books. So I have a bookshelf behind me that you can see, and at least half of that shelf behind is full of craft books on one shelf alone.
Snap.
Yeah. And I read them obsessively. So I've read about the snowflake method. I think Randy Ingebrigtsen, is it, or something?
Yes. Yeah.
Yes. I think that was one of the first ones I read, because I knew that, having reread my original 4 science fiction novels and stories, that I needed help to plot. And like all converts, I went from being no plotting at all to overly plotting everything. And interestingly, I've found that over the last year, I do now plot extensively, but I only plot the first 2/3 of the book, because I know that by the time I get to that point, what I've created, it changes, as you know. You can plot as, I don't know if it's the same for you, Keith, you can plot as tightly as you like.
Absolutely.
But as you go along, new characters introduce themselves. Characters you didn't think were important suddenly come to centre stage.
Yeah.
And by leaving the last third empty, I can then replot at that point to actually make sure that everything works as it should from there on. But that's how I work now. I'm still a very big plotter, and like I say, I read. I have a couple of books that I read before I start each new book. And
Craft books.
Craft books, yeah, because they remind me of what I want to do and how I want to work, and they embed back into my head.
I should ask you what those books are, David. I think we should be told. Yes. So which
One
of those?
is Save the Cat.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Blake
Keith knows
has.
that one. That is Blake.
Who's the author?
Blake Snyder.
Blake Snyder.
Okay. That one is brilliant. It's about movies, but it's very applicable to novels. The other one is this one. Structuring Your Novel, K.M. Wheeland.
I think I've got that as well. Yeah.
It covers other people's work. I mean, there's another one here. Look, Robert McKee, which is huge. Yeah. That is the Plotter's Bible, but it's so big you can't. You just have to delve into that. But I look at both of those, and there's one by a lady called Libby Hawker that's really tiny, and it's Take Your Pants Off or something. Yeah. And that distills the Robert McKee's 800 pages down into about 80 pages. So it is great.
Like you, I've got a shelf full of craft books and various aspects of writing. Some of them I had since I was in my teens, but one of the ones that I've come more recently to is this one, the Ros Morris, which is, and there's two more in the series as well, and this is the first one that I've read, and I've found this very helpful because she has this method in there, particularly where you sort of draw out the structure of your book and you colour code it to make sure that it's balanced. Go through with highlighters and helps you look at it and helps you draw back from it, detach yourself a little bit from your plot, and to see it more objectively, more from the reader's point of view, which I thought was a really interesting process. I can see why the snowflake method and intense plotting like that could be helpful, particularly to somebody who is perhaps struggling or isn't as natural a writer or as an instinctive a writer. But I think it's also important to be ready to change your plot and change your mind, because otherwise, well, that's all part of the editing process as well, really, isn't it? I mean, considering that I know that you've said to me before, David, that you don't actually do a lot of drafts because you're not only do you plot out each book meticulously, but you've plotted out 10 books in the series, and you're just about to publish number 3, and you know exactly what's going to happen in each of those books already, and one book per decade, per year in a decade that you've chosen to write about, incredibly meticulously thought through, I think. So the degree of plotting that you do means that you don't have to do so many edits. How does that work for you?
I don't. I spend almost as long plotting each book before I start it as I do writing it. So I will spend between 4 to 6 weeks doing nothing but plotting with cards and various bits and mind maps and all sorts of things, so I know what's going on. Making character notes and looking up, doing the research that Rosalind mentioned, looking up the historical stuff, because I write historical mysteries in a time period that nobody knows anything about. I have to do an awful lot of research. But then I will sit down in like a white heat of between 4 to 6 weeks. I will write the novel from start to finish.
And that's what, about 80,000 words? 80,000
the one you've just you've just read is 95,000.
95,000.
So
Okay.
yeah, they're between 85 and 100,000 words for each one.
So that's well over the rate that you do in NaNoWriMo, for example, which is asking 50,000 a month. So you are motoring.
Okay.
Can I ask a question here, David? I think people who are essentially pantsers think that if you plot everything out in advance, that, oh my God, it's dull when you come to doing the writing, and that the plotting itself is so mechanical, how can you take any enjoyment from it? And I don't know about you, but I find that planning period, and I use mind maps as well, and I use other kind of tools to get my creative juices going. I find that terrifically enjoyable. That is, to me, a highly creative and enjoyable part of the process. And then when I come to doing the actual writing, and you're writing dialogue and you're describing characters, that too has a different kind of enjoyment to it. So it's not that one half is kind of bureaucratic and the other half is where the creativity comes in. All of that process, for me, anyway, is highly enjoyable. Now, am I putting words in your mouth, David?
Exactly. Yeah. I think we must be. I even enjoy proofreading and editing. So the whole of the process. But I made a note here when I think Rosalind or Debbie was talking before, and people, as you say, Keith, a lot of people say I couldn't plot because it stifles my creativity.
Yes.
It wouldn't feel right. I actually find that plotting to the degree that I do releases my creativity.
Yeah.
I think there's an element of... Sorry.
I have the framework then, and I can write within that framework, and you are more creative. As you say, you're writing dialogue, you're writing characters, you're writing description, the scent and the taste and the sight of the places that you are in can come through much more easily because you have the skeleton and the framework within which to place it.
And it gives you kind of security as well, doesn't it? Because you know you're going to get to where you want to be because you've got that map laid down. But Rosalind, can we bring you in here? Because I think you're one of the people who has said that you would feel it would kill your creativity if you had everything plotted precisely. What's your take on that?
I think I'm in a different place when I write completely. I must say that I have had all these books. I have read them, and with a feeling of despair, thinking this isn't going to work for me. When I start to write, I'm in that scene. I'm in that character's shoes. I can only put it like this. Do you remember when we were children, we had those magic painting books, and all you needed was a brush and water, and there was nothing but a blank page, and as you painted, gradually the pictures came out of nowhere, and the colours and everything. So that's how it is when I'm writing. I don't know what's going to come, and I'm very immersed in what I'm doing. So if I'm in the library writing and a librarian comes up to me, I jump out of my skin. I'm actually that scene. And I think it's more like being in the theatre when if you're acting, you are that character. You're not that person in the audience thinking, oh, he's speaking nicely and what a deep voice he has, and I'm going to be excited at the next scene. You're not. You're in the scene and you're in that moment, and that's how I'm writing.
I think that's a trait of being a good writer, though, Rosalind, rather than the way that you do it. Because I'm sure Keith would say the same thing, and it holds for me equally. Yeah. Is that when you're writing, you are in that scene. It takes you over completely. Yeah. And it. In fact, when I'm in this 6-week period of writing the book, my whole mental outlook is different to normal life. It never really releases you until you've got it all down on paper.
And do you find your sense of time? Sorry.
I can quite see how David could have that framework, but when he comes to doing that framework, he's perhaps in a similar place to the way I am altogether. But if I sat down to plan, nothing would come. It would be harsh, it would be empty. I wouldn't have the ideas. I actually would sit there with no ideas. Whereas writing the way I am, I never have what this writer's block thing. I sit down every day and I don't know what's going to come, but something comes. And the same with the blog. I don't necessarily know what post I'm going to do, but an idea comes and I start the first sentence. More sentences are coming. It's very messy and disorganized, but somehow it gets finished, and somehow it, which I'm not aware of. And I think writing is a lot of it. We're using unconscious processes, and it is using a different part of the brain, of course, than when we're planning.
Well, you can give us some real insight into that, Rosalind, can't you? Because of your background as a psychologist and way the brain works.
If I'm not right, I can sit back and analyse what's going on. You know, if you asked me to analyse what another writer was doing, I was observing him or her, and then reading what they had written, I would probably be able to analyse what was on much better than I can do about myself. But I read somewhere, and this is interesting, you don't know the theme of your novel, whether you're a plotter or a pantser. You don't know what the theme of your novel is until long after you've finished. And that's certainly true of me. And I'm unaware of the underlying theme. I don't know whether David and Keith have the same, that if they look back at something they completed some time ago, there's some underlying theme that they hadn't been aware of when they were writing it. Would that be true?
For me, I think that is, sorry David, I think that is true for me. I'm trying now to work on the basis that I should know what my theme is before I start, and so I give a fair amount of thought to that. But I do admit that if I look back at older works, then stuff emerges from it that I didn't know perhaps I was putting in there. Can I ask another question, or actually probably make another statement, Debbie? It's about this notion of creativity. I used to work with bankers and creativity for my sins, having sessions with them to try and get them to think differently. And you'd ask them, yes.
Creative accounting, eh?
You'd ask a room of 20 people to stick their hands up if they thought they were creative, and one person would stick their hand up. And then you'd go through perhaps a half-day activity and exercises with them, giving them some tools to help them be creative. And at the end of the day, they were beaming and glowing because they'd found hidden resources within themselves. They'd enjoyed it. They found that if they had to be creative and were given the freedom to be creative, they could be. And if they had some tools, maybe mind mapping, maybe other tools, they could actually dredge stuff out of themselves that they didn't know was in there. And I think, going back to what Rosalind was saying, I think maybe that's something one has to do. You have to give yourself permission to be creative in whatever format you're working, whether it's as a pantser or as a plotter. I think.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I can relate to what Rosalind was saying about starting up with a sentence and not knowing where your idea has come from or where you're going to. I often find I get my best ideas when I'm not trying to get an idea at all.
Yes, absolutely.
In the shower or doing the washing up or whatever. And you have to sort of open up and allow yourself to recognise those ideas as being valuable, creative ideas. And I suspect a lot of people don't do that, and your bankers presumably weren't doing that. They weren't allowing themselves to do that. And I think that's a very important and very exciting part of the creative process, because sometimes I can be doing something, going around the shops or something, and suddenly this idea and this phrase and this story idea will come to me, and it's so exciting to see it. And you think, oh God, it's like magic. Where did that come from?
Yeah.
And that's very exciting. And occasionally, you know, sitting down at your desk, and suddenly your pen starts going, your keyboard starts rattling, and it's like you're taking dictation almost. You almost feel like you're possessed, you know. And that for me is like the most magic part of writing, most enjoyable. Although I do, like David, I do enjoy the editing and the polishing of the prose afterwards, and do tons and tons and tons of drafts of everything that I write.
But at the same time, you have to be careful that you don't force it. I suppose that there are times I come to a point in the planning and I think, oh, I'm not really sure what I should do yet. So I go for a walk. I have a cup of tea. You know, I do something else and just let it percolate. Let it cook in there, and then something comes. Always comes.
What do you think about?
I think also the point that Debbie made earlier about when you're stuck. Stopping that part chapter and going to a later point. I found that helpful 2 or 3 times, where a chapter is sticking, you're not satisfied with what's coming, and you leave it, and you go to the next chapter perhaps, or next...
I can't do that.
I can't do that.
I have to write in sequence. I can't jump ahead 5 chapters or anything. I have to finish one, and then that leads me to the next and the next.
If you haven't guessed by that, David and I were separate.
We all have different thinking styles.
Yes.
Yeah.
David is obviously a sequential thinker. It's like people who start to house improvements, and some to have a note and pencil and put all the tasks involved in order and then tick them off, whereas somebody else will have a whole holistic view and won't actually need to write them down because they'll know in what order they want to do things. And maybe that's a builder would be that kind of person, whereas the architect probably would need to plan and make the notes and order.
Do you let's talk for a minute about how many drafts you each do of your books or your stories. Do you find, does the way that you write affect how many drafts you need to do? David, I think you told me that you don't do many drafts.
I do 1 draft and then 2 other corrections with specific things in mind on each one.
Wow.
And then I send it to an editor.
Right. Keith, how about you?
I would count the very focused plan as a draft, because in that each scene is well organised. There are snippets of dialogue, snippets of description, scene setting, and then I write it, and then, like David, I go back and I edit, correct, maybe change an emphasis here or there. So that 3 drafts, I guess. Sounds like a lot.
Rosalind, how about you?
I would say 3, but probably only 2 if we're talking about shifting sections of chapter to a different place or cutting out something or changing something. The 3rd or 4th draft is more editing, tweaking words, thinking, oh, I could say this better, or this voice doesn't quite sound credible, and changing that. That's smaller events, but I'm at for every chapter. But structural draft, only 2.
That's interesting. I do. At the moment, I've primarily written short stories in terms of fiction. And I will go over a short story a dozen times, probably. Wow. Polishing, cutting down, editing. I think maybe I need to get a grip and move on. Clearly got too much time on my hands. But it'll be interesting, because when you're working with a story of 1,000, 2,000 words, it's very easy to do that, and you're working on a very small canvas. But when you've got 80,000, 100,000 words to do, I mean, you can. I then start to understand why some people say they've been working on a novel for 7 years or something, if they're taking that same attitude. When you're editing, do you edit the whole of the book at once, or do you edit the chapter that you've written the day before writing the next one? Do you look back at all, any of you, at what you've written the day before? You just keep going forward? David?
I just keep going forward. Yeah, I need to keep that momentum going. I might look back at the chapter to familiarise myself with where I was going and what was happening. But I will deliberately not edit it at that point, because the danger is that you can go back and you can spend 2 days editing one chapter.
Yeah.
And it's a waste of time, because by the time you get to the end of the whole of the book, you've got to go back and do that again anyway.
Keith. Sorry.
I tend to write late in the day, finishing often 6 or 7 o'clock, and then I put it to one side, and then I format it so that I can send it to my Kindle or Kindle app, and I read it in a different form, and at that point I highlight words and phrases that are infelicitous or the wrong word or simple typos. And then, so the next day, my first act is to go through what I wrote the day before and make those changes, and, as David says, refamiliarise myself with exactly what it was I've written. And it helps you kind of keep the mood or a consistency of tone as well. And then when I've finished the whole book, I go back and I do that again, which is, it's a good way of picking up any more typos that have crept in or other inconsistencies.
Rosalind, how about you? Do you have a different approach, or are you the same as the chaps there?
By inclination, I like to edit the chapter I've just before I go on, but I am increasingly disciplining myself not to do that. Scrivener is a help here, because it cleverly takes you exactly where you left off. So you've no excuse really that you finished before. You can continue on, and that's actually very helpful. But if you're asking how many times I edit over and over and over again every time I set eyes on my work, whether it's a read through or whether it's a particular chapter. I edit every sentence. I'll probably find something that I could do better.
Yeah, I can relate to that. Do you think that also comes from being partly a short story writer? Or does that nothing to do with it?
I deliberately stop after some time. Sorry, Rosalind, go on.
I was going to say I don't count as a short story writer. I find short stories much more difficult to write than novels. Although I have self-published this collection of short stories, I actually, and I've got quite a bit I've done, I actually find them very difficult to write because, my orientation is character development, as you might expect, and so my instinct is to develop it, and a character needs a much longer time span than I can manage in a short story.
Yes, yeah, that's a fair comment. It always, because I'm coming at it the other way around, and I've started off by writing short stories, and my background's all in short pieces, and I'm coming the other way around to it, and it always slightly astonishes me when somebody says, "Oh, but short stories are so hard to write," and I'm thinking, a novel is enormous. and one of the things that I found helpful in starting to crack on with a novel is using Scrivener. I mean, Orla Ross recommended it to me about a year ago, and she said, "Oh, it's life-changing, you've got to get it." And I have to say, I've been really impressed with how useful it is, not only for fiction, but also for the non-fiction books I write. And what tools do you favour? Rosalind, that's interesting you said that you like using Scrivener, although you're not a planner, not a plotter, but you like it too. What do you like about it?
In fiction writing, I'm a pantser.
Right.
I'm inveterate pantser.
Yeah.
I like Scrivener because I'm a disorganised person, and I have bits writing on all sorts of memory sticks and all parts of the computer and so on. Scrivener will be together. I like Scrivener because I can quickly reorder my chapters, though I don't tend to do that much. I don't need to do that much, I find, but it allows me to see where I've done something and where I've put something. I think there's a lot of power in it that I've yet to learn about 7 months, and I'm still learning, and I need probably to put the time aside to sit and watch some iTunes videos.
Yeah.
David's been using it for longer. More to say about it.
I found Scrivener for Dummies actually very useful. I've learned better from reading books than from videos, and this is nice because you can dip into it by Gwen Hernandez, and it's written in a nice friendly tone, so you don't feel stupid if you don't get something, and you can pick out bits and pieces as you go along and dip in and out, because you learn, as with any software system. I think you can start off using it in a very basic way, and you learn more as you need to learn more, really. Keith, what's your preferred tools?
I use Scrivener now. I've been using it for about 18 months. I did use other programs before that. What I've found extremely useful is that I've incorporated prompts as to how the structure of the novel should work into a template. So I work through my template.
You've got a recipe then, kind of a recipe for the perfect novel then, with all the ingredients.
Yeah, you know, there are headings for like the inciting incident and the gate and the midpoint and so forth, and so you then have prompts in those template headings, questions to say, you know, what happens here, who's this character, what are they thinking, blah blah blah. I'm summarising madly, and then once I have that, I can transpose what I've written as the answers to these things into the beginning of my plan, which then gets transposed when I start writing it. So I find it enormously helpful to do that, because I don't know, I think maybe like Rosalind, I'm quite disorganised, so I need these tools to help me think in a structured way. Otherwise, I'd be writing a novel every 7 years, which is not. I can't afford to do that.
So that sounds very prescriptive, really, and very interesting.
Well, I think this goes back to something David said earlier on, and if it wasn't, I'm saying it was him anyway. When you start to work on your structure and on your plan and on your detailed chapter notes, it doesn't mean that the creativity ends when you then start writing the book, because there are wonderful moments when you're 2/3 of the way through and you think, oh my God, yes, they're saying that because of this that happened earlier on, and then I can make that relate to that later on. So what I'm doing with the plan is giving myself a skeleton, a very very well structured skeleton, but when I'm writing it, oh God, what a terrible cliche metaphor I'm coming out with. When I'm writing it, I'm going to put the flesh on the bones.
That's a great analogy, actually, because we've all got the same skeleton inside us, haven't we? We're all entirely different. So I like that analogy.
No, in my books, I strip the flesh off the skeleton. I think Keith and I will have to get married, because I'm exactly the same way.
Separated at birth, David.
Yeah, must have been.
Oh. We've talked about, we're obviously all pretty keen on Scrivener and that kind of thing, but I know we've had conversations previously about other kinds of tools and apps that can help you write, which are sometimes very sort of rigid about rules of grammar and all that sort of thing, things like the Hemingway app and things like that, and I know we've had some very entertaining conversations about those. Do you use any of those, or are you kind of people who would run kicking and screaming from anything like that? Oh yes. Now I've got.
Say something, Rosalind, so we can see it. I can't see it.
Yes.
It's a new book. How to read.
I only have it on Kindle, so I won't show you that.
Now, this is interesting because this is the book that we had at school when I was at high school, and it was absolutely drummed into us the right and wrong way to write sentences. And I went to an American high school, and they were much more rigid than an English schools at that point, where you would diagram a sentence and you do these little maps of where all the bits of the sentence went. It's terribly rigid, but it stayed with me. And we're talking about apps, but actually books like that are fantastic. Who needs apps when you've got books?
My favourite writer. Sorry, David.
Your favourite writer, Keith?
I was just saying the books. You don't read the book and then start writing because you've read that book. You're in the middle of writing and you think, oh, should I do this or that? And you refer to it. More of a prop than a guide.
Yes. Yeah.
My favourite writer for that kind of help, if you like, is a chap called Sol Stein, who's an American writer and editor, and he's written a couple of books, Solutions for Writers, and I think Solutions for Editors or something like that. They have different titles in the UK and the US, and he's very, very good on helping you look at your own prose, not grammar per se, but how you construct sentences. He talks about triaging your work, to look at it in a way like a surgeon looking at a poorly person and saying, what's wrong with this person and this sentence, and how can we make it work? And I learned a lot from him. I always recommend him to people who are taking up writing.
Yeah, I used to use all sorts of editing apps at one point, and I've stopped now because after you've used them for about a year or 18 months, you begin to learn what your own failings are, and you stop making the same mistakes over and over again. I just got the book back from my proofreader, who thinks she's an editor. And she said I used the word recognised far too much, and she changed it. But she changed it to really weird words. So I had to go through and look up other words for recognised that were not quite as antediluvian.
I think that there's one or two apps that are really useful for identifying your verbal tics. If you don't, because we've all got them, but we don't know that we have them. When I used to work in marketing, I used to always be saying things were delightful, and I don't know why, but people would laugh when I came up with another draft that had the word delightful in it, and because we simply do not know whether we're doing those, and I think some of these apps that automatically show you how many times you've used a word are helpful, but only after you should only use them as a I think before you actually have your proper edit or proofread or proof edit or whatever you're having done, because it just saves your editor a bit of doing it for you, really. To perhaps nearing the end of the conversation now, perhaps we should be thinking about the dear reader, rather than talking about the writer's perspective. And we've been talking a little bit at the beginning about can a reader notice how a book is written? Can they notice how you've planned it or not planned it? I'm sure you've all had similar experience to one that I've had in certain reviews, where people have detected a theme or observed something about my writing that I just haven't noticed at all until they've said it, and I thought, but of course, why didn't I notice that about my own writing? And so, although we think we're the authorities on writing our own books, actually it's the reader that makes the ultimate judgment. Any thoughts about whether the reader can recognise your process?
Can I say something about that? Because I work in a genre which is crime writing, and in a even tighter genre, private eye writing, and even tighter, hard-boiled private eye writing. And so there are certain conventions that are expected, I think, by readers in that genre, and I have to be aware of understanding those conventions, even though I then push them, because I like to think that I've been expanding from writing a straightforward Philip Marlowe-esque private eye story into more of a kind of thriller genre, because I think people are more willing to accept that these days. So a lot of my novels have kind of big, I wouldn't say explosions at the end, but they have big confrontations at the end, and so I've been aware of trying to develop a hero who has certain characteristics, to have someone who helps him achieve his goals, to have the hero put in peril at some point before finding something that helps him achieve his end. And I think working in genre where the characteristics are well known and well expected, then I have a kind of responsibility to meet readers' readers' expectations with those things.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, so that sorry.
I was going to say I like working within the boundaries of genre. Again, it's like when you do a lot of plotting, it frees me up to write. Writing within genre frees you up to write as well, because you know you have to do certain things and meet certain expectations. But just to come back to the original question, Debbie, I'm always amazed how much people see in your work or in my work that I never intended to be there. And some of that is by not writing too tightly, not being overly descriptive in some cases, and allowing, because people read through their own perceptions and their own prejudices. And they will, if you leave the space for them to do it, they will imbue those prejudices into your work and take from it maybe something that you never intended, but which is perfectly valid when they do take it from you.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Rosalind, did you want to have a comment about the readers? What do you think about your readers? And can they tell how you've written? I mean, I've already confessed that I couldn't tell how you've written yours. I just enjoyed it.
Thank you. And I'm afraid I'm so within my characters that the characters are not aware that they're readers. And so I can't think of the readers until and then when I finished it in the next draft or something, I will think of the reader if I think, well, this is a long, turgid passage, or these chapters, not enough is happening. I will think of the reader then, but I'm afraid that in the writing of it, I've only got the characters in mind. And I have read the advice about thinking of the reader. I do care about the readers, obviously, because I want them to read my books. But I can't have that analytical approach while I'm writing. I can have it before I write or after I write, but not during.
Now, it's been an absolute pleasure having this conversation and talking about all the ways that you all work differently. You've all been writing for some time and are comfortable in your writing skins, as it were. What advice would you offer to any new writer who is still trying to find their feet, find their voice, find the right method that works for them? What would you, Rosalind, what would you offer to advice to somebody who is starting out?
By all means, read everything. By all means, try everything. Later, you'll write the way that you write, because you're going to be a writer who has your personality and your outlook and your background. You may pick up skills and tools along the way, but only you can write what is going to be your style. You'll develop it along the way. You can only develop it by writing lots and writing often.
And I think reading lots as well is really important as well, isn't it? To
Well,
see how others are doing it.
Yeah.
I started with that. I said, by all means, read.
Yes. Yes. No, I think that's very sound advice. Keith, have you got anything to add to that?
Well, only to say that it kind of builds on what Rosalind said, that it used to be the mantra that you write what you know, which means I'd be writing about the life of a business psychologist, for God's sake, and that would interest no one. But I think the new mantra is write what you read. You know, so if you are someone who reads a lot of crime fiction, as I was, then write about that, because you're more likely to know the conventions. The same for historical fiction or even literary fiction. You know, although that is a very, very broad categorization. But to write what you think in your bones you really know works.
David, what would you like to add?
Read what you love, write what you love, and join the Alliance of Independent Authors.
Fantastic. Oh, I can't beat that advice. And I have to say, the conversation that we've been having here is the kind of conversation that we expand upon all the time on the blog, the Ally blog. On a Wednesday, we have a writing slot, and we often have posts on there about different aspects of writing, why people write the way they write, why they write what they write, what tips and tricks they would like to share with others. So to anyone listening to this broadcast who has enjoyed this, do stop by the Ally blog on a Wednesday in particular for more of the same, and also often on Monday, which is our opinion day, when we have people talking about strong feelings about different aspects of writing and self-publishing. So I think we probably need to wrap up now, and just want to say thank you very much to all three of you for joining in the conversation. Certainly highly recommend anyone interested to look you up online, find out more about your books and enjoy your books, and see what they think of your books, to see whether they can tell the secrets of your plotting and pantsing that's gone on into the making of your book. So thank you very much.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.